So today, as you all know, we're here to talk about conducting a board self-assessment. And this is a process that our board at the CFNRV went through in 2019. So we're going to talk first about how that went, how our board landed on the approach that they landed on. So Jess will talk about the purpose and overview of a few approaches that we considered and researched in the process. And then Pat Heyer, who is our board president, and Paula Alston, who is a board member as well, will talk about the specific approach that we use. So we're looking forward to digging into it today and learning more about this process. So I think without, so a couple tips, and we've been doing this for a few years now, but just a reminder, if you could just mute your mic when you're not speaking, and feel free to use the chat if you have a question. We'll certainly have time at the end for Q&A. And at the bottom, there should be subtitles available for folks that might not be there today. I'll check that out to see if it's working, but usually we like to have subtitles going just because it's an accessibility measure to have those running, and they're automatically generated. So sometimes they'll say funny things, but they're pretty accurate and just helpful to have. So I'll see if those are working today. And then, of course, wherever you are today, we're just glad that you're here. Feel free to have your video on or off. Whatever you would like is fine with us. So I can stop chatting and I will turn it over to Jess.
Right. Thanks, Lindsay. So my part here is just to talk a little bit about kind of the role of a board self-assessment. And we took some time when we did this in 2019 to look at different models. And so I'll talk about a little bit about that before Pat and Paula go into what we ultimately landed on doing for our board. So Lindsay, could you go to the next slide for me? Okay. So first I want to start by kind of putting the board self-assessment in context. And the best place to start is to really look at, hopefully you have a job description for your board members. If you don't, that's something good to have, because just like you would for a staff member, for a board evaluation, you're really looking at how the performance against what the expectations are as they're articulated within a job description. So I took the key components of the job description that we supply to our board of directors as we're recruiting them. And we'll just walk through these because these will form the foundation of a self-assessment process. And these are all things that are pretty self-explanatory if you're thinking about a board of directors. So this is the group that's going to determine the mission and purpose of the organization and constantly revisit that over time. If you're an organization that has staff, this is the group that will select the executive director or chief executive of the organization, and particularly set the job description and evaluate that person. And we could do a whole other session on the importance of staff evaluations as well, but particularly for the chief executive role, that's part of what the board does annually. Of course, the board also provides financial oversight, which includes setting the budget and then making sure there are financial controls in place so that you are meeting all the standards for nonprofits when it comes to proper financial management. Next slide, Lindsay. The board of directors also ensures adequate resources. And so that means that they need to help think about what kind of resources are needed for the organization to function and fulfill its mission and programs. And then they support fundraising efforts. And you all get to decide for each organization what that means for your organization in terms of fundraising, whether you're asking them to actively be involved in an event or to solicit donors one-on-one, but in some way, the board is involved in ensuring that there are resources to run the organization. This is also the group that's looking at legal and ethical integrity and accountability. So that means making sure that you are filing all the right paperwork with the IRS or the SEC, making sure that you're accountable to those entities when it comes to your legal requirements, but also sort of ethical norms for your organization. And then the board is also the group that does organizational planning along with the staff, but really sets the direction for the organization overall and monitors that direction over time. Next slide, Lindsay. And then finally, some other things that the board does. Hopefully the board is actively involved in recruiting and orienting new board members and assessing the performance of the board, which is what we talk about today. So you want a board that helps perpetuate itself. You also want the board to help enhance the organization's public standing. So they're the ones that represent you out in the community as an organization, not just your staff. And that they can kind of articulate the main work that your organization does, in our case, the foundation does. And then finally, the board is also monitoring programs and finding ways to be able to strengthen those. So working hand in hand with the staff in monitoring how well you're pursuing the mission of the organization. So these are all the things that hopefully, if you have a job description for your board, these kinds of things are included. Obviously, they're modified depending on the particular work of your organization, but these are pretty standard for any board. And these form the basis when you're looking to assess the performance of the board. So next slide, Lindsay. So why evaluate the board? I think there are a lot of different things that are good about this process, both in terms of evaluating performance and just creating a board culture. So promoting accountability is certainly a major part of it. And I think sometimes it can be easy for nonprofit boards to have a more hands-off approach and really look to the staff primarily as the ones that are responsible for the organization, when really the board of directors is responsible and works hand in hand with the staff to move the work forward. So being accountable in that sense. It can also be really important as you're thinking about board recruitment and training. So what kinds of information is it helpful for board members to have when they first join the board? What additional training might be helpful over time, particularly when it comes to financial management? What do they need to know in order to fully carry out that oversight role that they have? Or are there particular types of skills or expertise that might be helpful for you to have on the board? And the assessment process can help tease that out a little bit. That helps identify areas for improvement or policy or program changes. And then I know Pat and Paul are going to talk a little bit about the role that it can play in just strengthening relationships between board members, allowing them to get to know one another better and function better as a unit. And then also all of the different models we looked at really emphasize the importance of celebrating accomplishments and successes of the board. So oftentimes the board is there and they're sort of dealing with sticky issues or talking about how we need more money or whatever it is, but it's important for the board to also celebrate what's going well. Next slide. So when we started embarking on this process, Pat and others that were in the group that was on the assessment team looked at a lot of different models, and we can share many of those with you, and you can do just kind of a standard Google search to find some great models. But generally, they shared some similar characteristics. First and foremost, all of them recommend having some sort of assessment team of a few board members that just helps design the process. And really making sure that it is driven by the board. So, staff can certainly have input into the process, but really it's about what the board wants to know about itself and from its members. And then from there, that assessment team has developed some sort of questionnaire. And it includes some of the things that you see here. So getting a sense from board members about what's working well, what are potential weaknesses of the board, getting a sense of whether board members understand their roles, thinking about how board meetings or committee meetings are structured and whether those are good uses of the time of the board. And then these other pieces around planning, financial management, fundraising, and communications. So there's a variety of different models out there in terms of how you can craft questions within those areas. And we'll share the questions that we used in the Foundation self-assessment momentarily. Next slide, Lindsay. And then after you have done the process, and I'll talk about some different ways that you can actually use the questionnaire, but however you choose in terms of the format of your self-assessment, it's important to then go back and take a look at the responses you get from board members to find some common themes or areas where the board might want to take action. And once those are identified, to really share that information out with the board. So and part of the importance of this is being transparent about what goes well and what doesn't. So in some sort of report to the board and to the staff as well, talking about those findings, celebrating what's going well and identifying areas for improvement. And then particularly identifying specific changes that might need to be made or modifications to how you run a meeting or the types of materials there. So if there are areas where the board wants to take action, being clear about those, and then talking about a timeline for considering that so that the board feels like this was a good use of their time, just like any evaluation would be. This is a good use of the time and you're going to act on areas where there may be some room for improvement. Next slide. And then finally, there's a lot of different formats that you can use. So the assessment team will develop questions, but there's various ways that you can then ask those questions of board members. Many of the examples that we found, and you can find easily online, are some sort of survey, and it can be paper or online. It allows for pretty easy data collection, and the surveys are typically kind of that agree to disagree scale. You know, how well does the board use its meeting time, and then asking members to assess that. That can be quite helpful because obviously the data collection is pretty easy, but it doesn't always allow for kind of the nuanced discussion that might be helpful. And I think particularly if part of the goal of the assessment is to develop relationships or stronger relationships between board members, a survey might not accomplish that in the same way. So other examples include peer-to-peer interviews. That's what we did at the foundation. So Pat and Paula will talk about that in much more detail. It allows for those nuanced responses and relationships, but it is more time consuming. And you have to take the time to kind of evaluate individual responses. They're not just there in the online forum. You need folks to be taking notes and to be mindful about what they're hearing. But in that sense, it allows for a much deeper conversation. And then finally, some examples that we found also were sort of a focus group or a group meeting format. And that allows for members to play off one another. So they might not necessarily answer in a certain way if it's just themselves, but when they hear another response, they may want to say, yeah, I agree with that, you know, by the way, and add to it. And of course, there's fewer meetings required if you're doing this within a group. But just like any group setting, you have to be mindful of are there certain dominant voices in the room. And then sometimes it can be difficult to tease out where there's consensus because you don't know whether folks are agreeing for the ease of agreeing or whether they all, you know, have that same feeling about a particular thing. So there's a lot of pros and cons depending on what works best for your board. And I think the biggest thing is that the assessment team of board members is really the group that decides what works best for them. Because the process is really driven by the board members as opposed to by staff members. And I think that's my last section. So with that, we'll kind of go and take a deeper dive with Pat and Paula on the example that we have at the foundation.
How interesting. I just got a phone call just as this was happening. I thought I lost the whole meeting. So hope that doesn't happen again. Do you want to go to the next slide for me, Lindsay? So I want to just set the picture here a little bit about what stage of development the Community Foundation was at when we decided to go ahead with a self-assessment, because I think it might matter what tools you are using depending upon whether your board is in crisis or the organization's in crisis or whether you are just looking for improvement. And if you're in crisis, you may not be using this process. You may be doing something altogether different, like hiring a consultant to try to build some trust so that you can move forward. We were not in a stage of crisis when we did this at all, but I did think that we were in a transition point. So the foundation was founded in 1994, and for 20 years, a lot of the board helped do the work. It was so small, the staff was so small, that a lot of the board members, those founding members in particular, who held the passion that got the foundation started, actually kind of an operational board. By the time I joined in 2016 and Paula joined in 2015, we could already see that the staff was becoming more professionalized. Jess was coming into her own as a leader for the organization. Laura was there, solid and performing well. We had a staff whom we could trust to take on the operational responsibilities, and the board, which still had a few founding members associated with it in the middle 2010s, could become and should become a more governing board, much more distant from the operations. So that's the kind of moment in time that we were at during the mid 2010s. And by 2019, we were kind of ready to think about all of the protocols that we put in place. For example, monthly meetings and how we got our information, what our packets were like, all of these kinds of basic things. It was time to kind of reassess all of that work and to see if there was a better way to do that. So in our case, sorry, I seem to be having phone problems right at this very moment. At this very point in time, we decided to create a committee. We got 5 of us. Our board is 16 members. And we did have a couple of board meetings in which we talked about what we wanted to achieve. And that helps you decide what kinds of questions you're going to ask. We did decide to do interviews.
We're getting the test of the VT alert system here. Yeah. Please hold everyone for all the VT affiliated folks. It plays at the CRC where our team is as well.
I'm sorry. And of course it plays on my phone, and I have, 5 different ways in which I get it.
Yeah.
So sorry about that interruption. Anyway, we did look at this last bullet here. We did decide to do the peer-to-peer interviews. We thought it was an opportunity to build relationships and get to know each other better, which can't really happen in a standard board meeting. So we want to talk a little bit. Paula's going to talk a little bit about how we decided to do those interviews and what the questions were that we asked. And then we'll come back to what we learned from that process. Do you want to go on, Lindsay, to the next slide? Do you want to start, Paula, here? Yeah, Paula.
Sure. Just to build a little bit on what both Pat and Jess has said, my previous experience before I joined the community board, community foundation board, was with my own governing board at the place where I worked. And that board was really hands-off. They didn't give me any feedback during meetings, much feedback during meetings. They just all sort of sat there and nodded their head. When we talked about doing a self-assessment, they were okay with it, but they left it completely up to me to find the questions, to decide how we were going to do it. They didn't really want any part in defining how we were going to do this assessment. So I came up with some questions. I did what most people do. I Googled it, found a lot of examples and questions. And so we decided to do a survey. And I can tell you that you don't get much quality feedback from that. We didn't do the disagree, strongly disagree type. They were somewhat open-ended, but when you do it anonymously and you do it as a survey, it's very easy for the board members just to say yes or no, or I like this, but they don't give you the information that you need when you do a peer-to-peer type survey. So if you've got the time and if your board is big enough and if they're involved, I would strongly recommend you doing the peer-to-peer, because we really were able to build a relationship with the 3 or 4 people that we interviewed. And we divided the board up. I think there were 5 of us doing the interviews, and we divided the board up among us, so we each only had 2 or 3 people to interview. And you get to know the people well. You can start off by giving them softball questions like, so how was that trip you took 2 weeks ago? Or, you know, how's your daughter? I understand she was sick, or something like that, something that you know about that person. And that sort of warms them up a little bit before you launch into what is it that we don't do right. But we found, at least I found when I interviewed my 3 people, that they were willing to talk. And it really gave you a great opportunity to ask the follow-on questions that you wouldn't get in a survey. Maybe they say something that triggers a question in your mind, like, well, tell me more about that, or how did that work, or what is your experience in that area? So I would, again, recommend that you do the peer-to-peer interviewing if you've got the time. Lindsay, you want to go to the questions? I think that we borrowed a majority of our questions from another organization, which is called R&D in both Rotary and in my previous library world, and that stands for rip off and duplicate. So it's okay to do your R&D, because why reinvent this whole process? So we came up with the questions and we tweaked them a little bit. We interviewed each other first to see which questions worked, which ones didn't, and where we needed to make some adjustments. And then we launched into our interviews, and we started off by hoping that they'd be about a half hour, but most of them went beyond that because our members were more than willing to talk to us. And we designed the questions around some of the information that we hope to get out of them. If you think there's an area that you want to improve, then go ahead and craft your questions around that. From my point of view, I don't think there was really any surprises that came out of it, but it did validate some of the things that we were feeling, and that was that we didn't necessarily need to meet every month, and that we weren't the only ones on the board who didn't understand the treasurer's report because it was too detailed. It didn't give us a clear picture, and I guess most of us are visual. We wanted those nice charts where everything was laid out and you could easily see where you stood on any aspect of the budget. And those are the things that came out of our questions. Lindsay, I think, can send you a copy of the questions when we're done, so you don't need to be struggling to write these down. We had 13 questions, and Laura Beth wants those. We had 13 questions, and I think that was the right number. We probably could have dropped 1 or 2. We could have added a couple of more. But there wasn't any one question after we finally got them down to what we wanted that I didn't think worked. Pat, from your point of view, with the people you interviewed, I thought all the questions worked well.
That's correct. I think they did. And then sometimes what happens is somebody answers something so thoroughly. You'll see that there are more questions on the following slides, but they've answered something so thoroughly above that they say, I feel like I've addressed that. So, you just go on if that happens. But it elicited a lot of, I thought, very thoughtful comments. And I was pleased with the way they worked to open up conversations.
And if you have board members who are introverts, then this process works well because they're more willing to talk one-on-one than they would be in a group setting. I mean, they would do fine in the survey. That's probably their preferred method. But in a group setting, they would be the ones who would just sit there and kind of nod their head and think. And I'm one of those, so I can tell you exactly what they're thinking. Dang it, why didn't I say that? So, Lindsay, you want to go to the next slide for questions, and then just take a quick look at some of the other things. But one thing you'll find, whichever method you use, if if you think back to the slide that Jess had with the little cartoons, her cartoons are brilliant. But the one where they're talking about the board effectiveness, and they were coming up with answers like extremely well, brilliantly, stunningly. I can tell you that every board thinks they're doing a great job. And so you will get these kind of comments, you know, we do this really, really well. And as a director, you might be thinking, no, you don't. But it's just which side of the coin you're coming from. And the next slide, Lindsay, these are the last 3 questions. I think it was a fascinating process. I was glad I got to be in the role of an interviewer through the process, so I got to meet members that I don't normally or didn't normally get to sit by or talk to at the meetings. And it was so, the outcome was so different from my own board, and I was still working at the time when we did this, that it was just it just amazed me that it was a great process. I'm glad we did it this way, and whoever came up with it, thank you.
Okay, Lindsay, you want to go on to the next one? So just to add on to Paula's nice comments about what we learned about it from our own viewpoint, because we ran it, Jess did not run it. So it really was a board-driven process. We did accept responsibility for that. By the way, we took extremely detailed notes. Any of you who know me already know that I take note-taking is my specialty. So we ended up with transcripts, and I combined all of those by question, and then the committee looked at all of the answers for those. And one of the things that I found, Paula, too, was I was so heartwarmed by the sense of commitment to our mission that I heard from some of our board members. We don't talk about that at our board meetings. And it was wonderful to hear that in response to some of those questions about how much they took the mission of the Community Foundation and were so proud of it, you know, so that was a reassuring positive benefit to some of this. Anyway, so we did take what was essentially a transcript. Each of the interviewees gave me their notes from their interviews, one package per person. So I know who they were, but we were trying to just create an anonymous transcript with all of the comments unidentified by the person. And then we began to summarize those. And so we prepared a report with sort of the key findings. So, there might be 2 findings under the first question about what things work really well. And we had a number of really fine things said about how the way the foundation works, some fine things said about Jess, as you might guess, and then some things that we needed to work on. And then we made some recommendations from that. As my last bullet point is saying there, the whole point of this is to see if there are things to make improvements. And if you go to the next slide, please, Lindsay. So we were meeting monthly. This had 2 problems to it. One, it absorbed a tremendous amount of time for our volunteer board members. And at that time, we were still meeting in person, which means, and of course, we have multiple county representatives on the board, which means that some people were driving an hour to come to each meeting, each direction. That was a huge commitment. It also caused a little bit of stress on attendance as a result of trying to meet every month. So one of the issues for some of them, especially those of us who had experiences with other kinds of boards, governing boards, were that we really thought we could meet less often. And it was critical to make that decision for another reason. The staff was absorbed constantly in preparing the next packet for the next board meeting. And with the staff the size it is, they, much of their time was going into, I call servicing the board, preparing those financial reports, trying to get all that paper packets out, trying to get us to meet, doing minutes, all of the kinds of stuff that goes to have an effective board meeting. Was staff involved and drained their time to do more important things. So key decision wasn't hard to make after looking at the findings from our interviews. Can't we meet every other month? And then our task was to figure out how do we manage the board business deadlines that we need to approve. We need to approve grants. We need to approve scholarships. We need to do our board recruitment. We need to do our audit. There are key dates on our calendar that have to be done. And Jess and the staff blocked out which things needed to happen at which board meetings. And then the executive committee now meets in between. So it reduces the number of meetings. There's still a lot that Jess and staff have to prepare for, but it reduces some of what you might call the administrative load. And we also did a major overhaul in the financial information because, as Paula mentioned, most of us were completely clueless about what was going on. We were presented with so much detail at the board meeting that you were drowning trying to prepare for the board meeting, and some members were not because they glazed over at the detail that we were being presented. And of course, it depends too on how good your treasurer is. So we have a fabulous treasurer right now. So he's much better at explaining to us, look at this number here. This is an important number, you know. So he helps drive our attention to things that matter and says things. But at the time we did this survey, that wasn't happening in that way. And many of us, I'm included, not just Paula, you know, we have some experience with budgets, but we really couldn't articulate what were the big picture issues going on. So over the next year, we developed a key indicators dashboard that we now see. I don't know, Jess, how often do we see that? Twice a year, something like that?
Yeah. Typically about
Twice a year or quarterly or whatever. We have some of those reports. And then we have, you know, much more detailed financial reports going to the executive committee, who takes on the primary responsibility for making sure that we're secure and that the rest of the board understands the big financial picture. And then we had a bunch of little suggestions too about where we were with, at that time, Give Big and needing to move to Give Local and marketing, and how we needed to work to support staff development. It was clear that our staff was becoming more professional, and we had not and could not always, through our unrestricted funds, find the money that it takes to support Jess and staff's involvement in their own training and development. So there were lots of smaller issues like that that we wanted to address and did address. But some of the key factors then are kind of overhaul the financial information about how we interact with each other, make sure that our scheduling doesn't kill off every board member's interest in participating because it was just too big a burden. I should say our board also has very active committees. And if you're on the full board that was meeting every month, you also had to be on a committee. So some folks were spending a lot of time and finding that difficult to manage. Their relationship to the scholarship committee that they cared about deeply involved them for 3 months in reading applications and making decisions. If you were on the grants committee, there was another 2 or 3 months involved in reading those applications and distributing those funds. So to the extent that we could manage this balance of between the overarching governing board responsibilities and our roles in participating in the selections of where our funds are given, which all of us enjoy, by the way. Board members really like to interact with the scholarship recipients and the grant recipients. So that was sort of the fun part of the job. Try to balance off where we're asking board members to spend their time. And I believe that's the end of me, Lindsay, isn't it? Yeah. So we can open it up and talk about both what we learned from this broader exploration of how board self-assessments worked before we started. That's Jess's part, which I thought was well summarized. And then what we did for the case study, obviously relevant to our organization, perhaps not to yours, but nevertheless, it was a worthwhile process.
Thank you so much, Pat and Paula and Jess. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see each other during questions. That was really wonderful information. We'll absolutely send out the recording of today and as well as resources, including that list of questions. So at this time, if folks have any questions or comments, please feel free to unmute and ask.
And I'd love to hear if some other organization has done their own self-assessment and what their experience was.
This is Susan Mattingly with the Lyric. We've done periodically, every couple of years, we do a survey that is just paper and people check things off and it's sort of just touching base. But I'm retiring soon. We have a chair who's been chair for a number of years rotating off. So the Lyric is kind of looking at what could be a loss of institutional knowledge.
Mhm.
And it seems like this would be a time that we're right for this kind of assessment, like, so people can figure out where our weaknesses are, where we should strengthen board processes. So, because I anticipate in the coming next couple of years, the board is going to have to lean in a little more than they have when they've had a director who's been there for 20 years, because they've kind of not had to do that as much.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's
So-
interesting. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to say, so I'd like to get a little feedback on what sort of format might be a little more useful for us under those circumstances, because we've done the checklist, the form that, you know, you pass it out, people turn it back in. It's useful, but only so far.
Well, I'd certainly say that interviews would be richer for certain. I don't know in your particular circumstance, Susan, though, whether you might want to have, I don't know, pay a graduate student or somebody to interview everybody individually rather than interview each other. I mean, you're at a transition point that you're facing and you're trying to figure out how to make that transition as smooth as possible. The board doing its own interviewing might find it more of a burden, or there's, ways you could.
Well, I also think that that's really a great idea. I hadn't thought about that, but a third party, I think people might be more frank and honest with, particularly if it can be somewhat anonymous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you have personalities in the room, you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, but you may think they're not pulling their weight. We all know what that feels like.
Right. So I mean, that's another possibility given your circumstances. It also brings up an issue, Susan, that we also dealt with on our board, and I'll just mention this because board attendance and engagement is obviously something that we pay attention to. So when we revised our bylaws, probably 2018 or so, I think, Jessica.
Yeah, that's right.
This is kind of my thing, I'm thinking if somebody doesn't show up to meetings and they're not there, then they've voluntarily resigned, so I'm hard ass about this. And so what we ended up writing into the bylaws was if you missed more than, I don't know, what did we say, 50% of the meetings or something like that. So we actually track, who's coming to meetings, and if they miss, we don't reappoint them. Now, we had one kind of difficult conversation with the board member about not reappointing them for attendance reasons. But we do track attendance, and if they can't make it, it doesn't have to be blame here. Some people can't make it because their life intervenes, that there's just stuff that happens. And so it has to be the board chair's responsibility to address people who aren't active and say, maybe you need to ease on out of this responsibility now, but having something in the bylaws to work with to make sure that you can annually find a way out that they've all agreed to because you've passed it in the bylaws, an expectation for involvement. And then Jess and I, if we have somebody on the edge of this attendance question, Jess and I will talk about, well, are they doing other things for the community foundation that I don't see? Because the board attendance is one thing, but we have a couple of board members who behind the scenes do fabulous things for us. And we would no more kick them off the board for missing one meeting more than they should have. Because that would be, spiting, what is it called? Cutting off your nose to spite your, whatever, that expression. Because they are doing things that Jess knows about that I may not seeing at the board meeting. So we kind of weigh where that's at and then, talk about whether we want to have that conversation with that board member or reappoint them or not. I'm sorry, that's a diversion to attendance, but engagement of board members is part of this process as well. If it's drifting off and you don't have any way to try to make sure that you have an active board, that's a whole nother issue that you need to address too. Did
There's-
anybody else have a thought for Susan about how she might go about it at this point in her transition? John had a question. How do you determine the readiness for board evaluation? Are there indicators? I don't know, maybe Jess, you want to say that too? Do you want to respond to that?
Sure.
I felt like we were at a moment in time for our board. You know, we revised the bylaws. We had a significant strategic planning effort. We were getting more members as new members of the board who had experience with governing boards, like Paula had experience with her own board. I worked with the Board of Visitors at Virginia Tech. That was part of my job. There were others coming on the board who had other kinds of visions of how boards might work. And so it felt like we could do it at that time. But Jess, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, folks may not agree, but I think this is just part of good management of an organization overall. So they should sort of always be ready. It's what the nature of the board assessment is that I think changes. So to me, it's something that boards should plan to do every few years anyway. It's just a best practice. But then really thinking through what is it you want to get out of it. So as Pat and Paula mentioned, we were at a point in our development where we were moving away from a working board and more towards a governing board. In other cases, it might be, a leadership transition like Susan has talked about, or a major change at the organization, an expansion, a new director, whatever it might be. And in that case, I think it's always helpful to have an evaluation that just is determining, what kinds of questions do you want to ask? What do you want to know of the board? As opposed to necessarily being ready, because I think it's something that, and part of this is going back to things like having a job description. And when you're recruiting board members, giving them that job description in advance and saying, here's what your expectation is, so that the board always understands that there's responsibilities and that they will be held accountable by one another, not by the staff. I think that's a big thing, but they're holding one another accountable at whatever stage of development that might be. You're on mute, Pat.
Let's invite John to see if he wants to follow that up in some way. John, is there some specific thing that you think you've got in terms of readiness?
Not really, but I do a lot of work in innovation and following innovation and using innovation models, and readiness is a key factor at different stages of innovation. And I was just wondering, I think about my board and how it's changed a lot in like 3 to 5 years. I don't think we're ready for an evaluation yet, maybe later, a year or so.
I do think, to your point, John, though, and we talk about this maybe more internally with the staff, is the pace of change at an organization, I think, is really key to think about. And we think about that a lot, is like, when do we want to bring certain things to the board, and have we put too much on them? Because I think sometimes, any volunteer board can say, whoa, wait a minute, this is too much too quickly. So I really take your point that if there's a ton of change, or that they've been really engaged deeply, that there's something to be said for providing a breather, as long as you know that maybe it's a year from now, it's still on the radar as something. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a really good point, is to think about sort of how much is too much, because folks are, volunteer, and they're not in the organization every day. And they still want to feel that ownership. And sometimes when change happens too quickly, that ownership isn't there.
Yeah. And we are very much, we went through a lot of change, and we're very much a working board, like which used to be. And yeah, we've gone to meeting every other month, but just trying to keep the work going has been a challenge. And so maybe getting some feedback on how to improve that would be something we could work on this year.
Yeah, and you might be able to do it in something lower effort than what we're described. Maybe you're not doing a full self-assessment. Maybe you're just checking in on certain ways you're operating, and trying to get feedback on that certain way or something of that sort. As I said, the full-blown method that Paul and I were involved in allowed us board members to get to know each other. Maybe in your case, if everybody's working together already, they know each other well enough that that's not a goal for what the self-assessment was about.
And maybe you don't call it a self-assessment, that sometimes scares
Mhm.
people. So call it a feedback session or come up with some other nice little glitzy name, but don't scare the board members right out of the gate by calling it a self-assessment.
That's a good idea.
Mhm.
And I could see it being fewer questions, but really targeted. And I appreciated what you said, Pat, of one of the goals was to get to know folks. So thinking about what your goals are at the beginning, it could be a shorter process in terms of the number of questions.
Yeah, our interviews often lasted an hour. They were kind of fun, actually. But they take a lot of time. So, you can do something that helps the board make improvements without it being as big a thorough deal as we described to you. As I said, we were in a sequence where we had done bylaws changes. That took about a year. Then we did a major strategic planning effort, or I don't remember the order of those. So, I mean, this was kind of a third major thing. So it was a stage at which we could say that we were ready because we'd done all of that homework about what was in the bylaws, about job descriptions for various roles on the board. We'd made progress on, I call it the infrastructure of a board. And the self-assessment grew out of that, I think, in part, in terms of timeliness, I would say. I don't look forward to doing it again right away because there are other big projects our community foundation board's involved with, but it was helpful at the time.
Yeah, we've just, after 6 years with no employees, we've hired an executive director. We have a real true strategic plan. We've, looked at and codified our bylaws and reorganized our committee. So we've gone through a lot of change. We have a clear job description, thanks to Jessica. She's helped me understand that.
These are crucial
short,
steps.
Yeah.
These are crucial steps you've taken.
Yeah.
Other questions or stories that people can tell about their own experiences with their boards? As you saw in our questions, this was really not an evaluation of Jess, which we do separately. And I see somebody on the call list and they'd like to talk more about a CEO evaluation. And I'm sure there's some models out there for other organizations, particularly the bigger ones who have to do a more formal evaluation. But we do a formal separate evaluation of Jess. The only question that was on our list of board self-assessment was about the communication between the executive director and the board. In other words, were we getting what we needed from her in order to be able to do our work? And was that communication open and two-way? And that was quite positive. So that was one of the strengths that we reported back out. But it was not, the purpose of our effort was not evaluating her, it was evaluating us. Are we about done?
Yeah,
I
and I
just-
think I just want to draw a comment Sarah made in the chat that I want to underscore about the importance of board relationship building and cohesion. And I like that comment in particular because at least I've found at the foundation that the board can act much more quickly when it's more cohesive. So we did, I'm sure like all of you, a lot of pretty significant changes during COVID, particularly in like our grant making process and stuff. And I was really heartened by how quickly the board was able to move, still having really substantive conversation, I think, about like, let's change how we do grants this year entirely so we can support organizations faster and things that were major changes that the board was able to vet, but also was pretty cohesive about, okay, this is our understanding of our mission and what we can and can't do well. So I always feel like that investment in relationships, even though it takes longer at the outset, maybe is a wise investment of time when it comes to acting in unexpected moments.
Yeah, and the work is never done. We did this self-assessment in 2019, but you know, half the board's turned over since then, or we have a bunch of new members. And so it's always up to us to try to find ways through our retreats or however else we interact at social events or donor events, for example, you know, trying to make sure that we talk to each other and get to know each other's interests and skills, since we may not be interacting in any other way other than on this board.
And because board members do change, that's why your onboarding of a new board member is so important, to get them so that they're ready to hit the ground running and don't feel like it'll take them 2 years or 3 years to catch up where the other board members are. And Jess does a very thorough onboarding session with new members. And I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and this has been really valuable. Thank you so much, especially to Pat and Paula, for sharing your knowledge and expertise, and especially for sharing a couple phrases: voluntarily resigned, and then R&D, rip off and duplicate. I liked both of those a lot. But thank you both, and thank you so much to Jess. Just quickly, like I mentioned, I'll send out the recording and our resources. But if you're looking for past recordings, I'm going to put the link in the chat. There's a short URL to find the recordings from past Third Thursdays. So cfnrv.org/resources. And then next month, we're going to be talking about effective media outreach. Still trying to figure out if that's going to be on Zoom or in person, but we will figure that out soon and be sharing that information with all of you. So hope to see you there. And we really appreciate you sharing time with us this morning.